Mediterranean island of Cyprus lies about 40 miles south of Turkey and about 500 miles east of Greece. It's an island which measures about 60 miles from north to south and about 100 miles from east to west, excluding the peninsula, which is known as the Panhandle. Now, it's divided into four main geographical areas: the Troodos Mountains, an average height of about 4,000 feet, with Mount Olympus over 6,000 feet; the Kyrenia Range, a range between 2,000 and 3,000 feet high; the Panhandle, of course; and the Central Plain, or Mesa Aurea. In 1958, the population of Cyprus was about 500,000. 400,000 of those were Greek Cypriots and the other 100,000 Turkish Cypriots. There's a history of British involvement in Cyprus for over 100 years. In 1878, Turkey invited Britain to occupy the island and to administer it on their behalf. And then in 1914, at the beginning of the First World War, when we were at war with Turkey, Britain annexed the island. Now, the Greek population, the Greek Cypriot population of the island, had always one political aim called enosis, or union with Greece. And this came to a head in 1950 when Bishop Makarios, a Greek bishop, was appointed Archbishop of Cyprus. And in 1951, he invited a colonel in the Greek army, Colonel Grivas, to come to the island and mount a military operation in pursuit of that political aim. In 1954, Colonel Grivas came to the island and he set up an organization called EOKA, the National Organization of Cypriot Fighters. And in 1955, they began their campaign with a program of sabotage against British installations. Those operations went on for about 4 years. And in this film, we're going to deal with the last 6 months of the emergency, the final round against EOKA. And to tell the story, I have with me here 3 people who were involved in the Cyprus emergency at the highest echelons of command. Lord Caradon, who, as Sir Hugh Foote, became Governor and Commander-in-Chief on Cyprus in succession to Sir John Harding at the end of 1957. Sir John Prendergast, who became Chief of Intelligence in Cyprus in November of 1958. And General Sir Kenneth Darling, who was appointed Director of Operations in October of 1958 and who remained in that post until the end of the emergency. General Darling, how did you come to be appointed to be Director of Military Operations?
Well, in the early summer of 1958, I was a brigadier in the War Office. And one day I was told that I had been selected to be the next Director of Operations in Cyprus and was to succeed General Joe Kendrew in October. The news thrilled me, as you can imagine, because at that time Cyprus was one of the major preoccupations of the British Army, and all the problems there would constitute a tremendous challenge to me. I therefore began bringing myself up to date with the problems of Cyprus. There was no lack of information and reports on the subject. For my part, I knew Cyprus, luckily, very well indeed, having been there more than once. And I always reckoned that I knew the topography of Cyprus almost as well as I know the topography around my own village in England. At an early stage, I was seen by the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Sir Gerald Templar, and he gave me the benefit of his views. I need hardly add that at that time there was probably no one in the British Army who had a greater knowledge or experience of handling situations such as Cyprus. So what he said to me was of tremendous help. At the end of our talk, he said to me that the Prime Minister had expressed a wish to see me before I went to Cyprus, and an appointment would be made nearer the time. The thought of this intrigued me not a little, as you can imagine. Towards the end of the summer, a number of visits were programmed for me around Whitehall. The 3 service ministries, the Colonial Office, the Foreign Office, the Home Office, and the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police.
Did you actually see the Colonial Secretary himself?
No, I didn't. He, in fact, was away. But I saw his POS, Sir John Martin, who was very helpful indeed. The last 2, that is, the Home Office and the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, were included in my rounds because the United Kingdom police forces had shouldered a tremendous burden in providing seconded British police officers to help out the Cyprus police in the emergency. The main impression I gained from these talks, and this is interesting in view of what happened later on, was that all was not well with the intelligence organization. And in fact, the way the matter was sort of summed up to me by more than one person whose views I respected, was that what we needed in Cyprus was not more soldiers, but more special branch. So I locked this bit of information away in my head and said, thank you. I must now recount 3 events which occurred and which in fact had a decisive impact on my task in Cyprus. And in retrospect, I think I can say that my guardian angel was working overtime on my behalf even before I set foot in the island. The first was the long-awaited visit to the Prime Minister. And on the appointed day, I turned up at 10 Downing Street. I hadn't been a frequent visitor in the past. And I was ushered in to the main hall, and almost immediately the Prime Minister appeared, and catching me by the arm, he sort of literally wheeled me into the cabinet room, sat me down at the table, and then for the next 30 to 40 minutes he gave me a most fascinating review of Cyprus, its international ramifications, and of Her Majesty's government's policy towards the island. He, of course, had only just returned from Cyprus, a visit to Cyprus, Ankara, and Athens, and clearly he had the whole business absolutely at his fingertips. And towards the end of his talk, he spoke to me in the following in the following sense. I want to emphasize that Her Majesty's government is determined to bring the Cyprus problem to an early conclusion and to stick by its policy, which it has already announced. Your task is to help the governor in every way that you can with the security forces to achieve this aim. I can assure you that you will have the full support of Her Majesty's government in your task, and no doubt you will face many dangers and difficulties in discharging it. But if you have any real problem which you can't solve locally, don't hesitate to let me know. I dare say that some of your requests will impinge on the province of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And then he added in a delightful way with those rather unusual eyes of his, looking me straight in the face, and said, but I can handle him. And so, as you imagine, when I walked out of 10 Downing Street on that day, I was walking on air, because there I was. I'd been seen by the Prime Minister of England. He'd told me exactly what my job was. He'd promised me all support. And the effect on my morale was terrific. And I knew really that nothing, no obstacle could possibly impede me. And then the first decision I almost took was that when I did arrive in Cyprus, at a very early opportunity, I would tell the gist of what the Prime Minister said to me to all members of the security forces, for obvious reasons. So that was really my visit to the Prime Minister, and it was the most helpful one. The second event was absolutely fortuitous, as indeed was the third, and this concerns Hugh. Sir Hugh Foote, as I knew him in those days, the governor. As the end of September closed, the situation in Cyprus got worse and worse, and clearly I was going to really dive into the deep end. So I said to my wife, I thought it would be a very good idea if we went off to Paris for a long weekend, and so that I would arrive in Cyprus in what you might call a proper frame of mind. And off to Cyprus we went. And the time came back, off to Paris we went. And the time came when we had to fly back to England. And when we got down to Orly Airport, there was a terrific tropical storm, absolutely tremendous. Terribly hot it was, almost as hot as it is in this studio. And immediately we had the well-known announcement, the BA regrets to announce that the flight was delayed and so on and so forth. And so our group in our plane hung about for some time. I noticed another group sitting about in the waiting room. And after about the third or fourth postponement, I got so irritable and bad-tempered and hot, I decided to go out on the tarmac outside and get some fresh air. And I noticed standing a little way away in the half-light, a lone man puffing a pipe. He was doing this, I may say, despite all the défense de fumer notices. And so I don't know why, I wandered up to this man, and the following conversation ensued, with me speaking first. Good evening. Good evening. I see you are delayed here. Yes, we are. We've been here about an hour or so. And where are you from? I'm from Cyprus. Oh, really? That is very interesting, because I'm very shortly going out to Cyprus as Director of Operations, and I suppose we shall meet. There was then an ominous pause. And then this lone figure turned to me and said, well, as a matter of fact, I am Hugh Foote, the governor.
What an extraordinary
Whereupon we roared with laughter and shook hands, and we went into the waiting place, and I introduced my wife, and Hugh Foote introduced his staff, and we had a brief discussion before we were invited to get on a plane and go on to England. So that was the second one.
Before you go on to the third, what was your first impression of the new Director of Operations?
Well, I'm glad that he should refer to this very important occasion in his life. That I can't imagine that any other meetings he had before he arrived in his new post compared in importance with that meeting on Orly Airport. I didn't know who this strange figure was coming up to me in the dark in Paris, and we didn't have very long to size each other up then. But subsequently, I had ample opportunity. I think I met him every day, every evening, from then on for a very long time to come. So it was a very important event in my life too.
The third of these events?
The third one occurred literally in my last night at home, my own house. And very late at night, the telephone rang. It was Mr. Alan Lennox Boyd's secretary. He was the colonial secretary at the time. And she said the colonial secretary wanted to speak to me. So I picked up the telephone, and we had a sort of a fairly brief conversation, and he said he'd been sorry, as you mentioned earlier on, he hadn't met me in London, but he hoped that all was well, and he wished me well in Cyprus, and so on and so forth. And like the Prime Minister, he said, if there's any problem that you can't solve yourself, don't hesitate, let me know. And somehow, and most luckily, it sort of rang a bell in my brain, and I said, well, as a matter of fact, the one field in which I believe I'm going to want help is the intelligence field, as I've been gathered that things are not right. And he said, oh, well, in that case, there's somebody called Prendergast. Never heard of him, I'm sorry to say. I had never heard of him. In Kenya, who would be just the man for the job if you want him.
Right, now, you were in Kenya at that time, Sir John, were you?
I was in Kenya, yes, as Director of Intelligence and Security.
And what other experience had you had of terrorist operations and this kind of emergency?
Well, I suppose my intelligence career started in Haifa in 1941, and there was a certain amount of contact with, shall we say, terrorists, so towards the end of my time in Palestine. We left there in 1948 and then to the Gold Coast, now Ghana. Again, I was in the intelligence field there. In fact, I helped to reorganize the special branch of the Gold Coast Police. And then I was asked to go to the Canal Zone for a while to be attached to the Army to assist in the intelligence field as well. And at the end of that, I went to Kenya, and after 5 or 6 months in various sections in the special branch, I was appointed as Director of Intelligence and Security for a number of years, in fact, of the fight against Mama. Mama had been tackled, of course, before I arrived, but there was the question of the reorganization again of the intelligence machinery.
Now, Lord Caradon, as Hugh Foote, as you then were, you'd already been in Cyprus for a year as governor when General Darling arrived. What was the political situation like at this time, 1958?
Well, it's difficult to cast one's mind back to an actual month, but it was about as bad as it could be. I had arrived there, yes, late in 57, and had walked straight into the situation that existed, which seemed to be one of bloody deadlock. And we put forward some proposals of our own, which I took home and got approved by the British government, but they were immediately and bluntly rejected by the Turkish government, who would not even allow me to visit Ankara as had been proposed. It was proposed that I should go to Athens and Ankara and explain what the new policy was then to be put forward. But having been rejected, we then had to worry about what possible advance there could be, and we had a very bad few months of frustration and growing sense of hopelessness almost. But we worked, and we worked on the second initiative. The main thing was to break the deadlock. How were we going to break the deadlock? And amongst other things, we tried to do some things by showing sympathy and understanding with the people of the island on both Greek and Turkish sides, who wander about, ride about, and walk about in the various parts of
Yes,
the
I
island.
remember. I was with my regiment in Kyrenia at the time. I remember you used to ride out to the villages. Am I right in remembering you had a white horse, or was that just imagination?
No, I think you just thought of me on a white horse. But I had my own chestnut horse, and I would ride out to the villages from time to time and sit down and talk with the people. And I think that was important, to give the impression that you were not there merely to carry out a repressive policy, but you were trying to find some basis of understanding. And that's what we were at. And we kept at it. After the failure, and the really very terrifying failure of my first initiative, having got the approval of the government, I felt, well, this is the way we're going, this is the policy to be followed. But within a day or two, I remember the dreadful day when the news came through about the Turkish reply, we had nothing to propose at that first few months, so we set to work out another initiative. The only difference in this one was that we said we'd go through with it to the best of our ability, even if it were opposed by both sides. And by gosh, it was opposed by both sides, violently opposed. But this time we did do what we said, and we went ahead with the policy which had been declared. But in the period you speak about, the period between my arrival and General Darling's arrival, then there is that year of a search for a solution. And by the time he arrived, the proposals of the Macmillan Plan, as it was called, had been announced. And so we had something to work to, but at the same time we had a violent rejection by both sides in the early stages. So our outlook at that time was one of, yes, determination, but also, I must admit, at that time we saw a little prospect of being able to make progress.
General Darling, you arrived to take over your post as Director of Military Operations in October of 1958. What military situation did you find when you arrived?
I think the first thing I'd better say a word about is really EOKA's organisation, because this, in a way, was the nub of the whole story. Grievous, a very competent operator, controlled very efficiently really three wings of his organisation. And the first was PICA, which was really which worked absolutely overtly in parallel to EOKA, and it was the political wing. And it exercised great influence over the local press, which Grievous had very cleverly and carefully had used to build up passions and a sense of hatred against government. Its membership was drawn from lawyers, doctors, members of the church, merchants, and so on. The second wing was ANE. This was
A-N-E.
A-N-E, ANE. I don't know that's the right way to pronounce it.
Yes.
And this was really the junior 11 of EOKA. A youth movement, you might say, boys and girls, 15 to 24, 23, 23, or thereabouts. And it was organised, as indeed was EOKA, on the cell system. And they had a multitude of tasks, working as couriers, intelligence gathering, flag waving, demonstrating, slogan painting, and so on and so forth, all those simple tasks. And I say they were a good junior 11 backup to EOKA, and ultimately they expected to progress into the senior team at some stage when it got older. And thirdly was the EOKA organisation itself. Its mainspring was the Greek Cypriot Orthodox Church, which created EOKA, produced the funds, and through its influence over the Greek, or the bulk of the Greek Cypriot people, ensured that it had their wholehearted support. In fact, I think it's true to say that the ordinary Greek Cypriot was coerced between the promise of spiritual heaven if they supported EOKA, and the threat of severe physical punishment, or worse, if they didn't. And not unnaturally, they chose the former course of action.
What would you say at this time were the main strengths and weaknesses of this organisation?
The strength of EOKA was the fact that it was organised on the cell system, which gave no direct lead to the really worthwhile part of EOKA, which was the top command structure. So it's very hard to reach anyone like Grievous or anyone on his level at all through the ladder of the organization. Another strength was the elimination of the small fry had little to no effect because there were thousands more waiting to fill the ranks. And the security forces, of course, couldn't expect any help or cooperation, or virtually none, from the Greek Cypriot population. And they had unlimited opportunities to attack some British nationals or property, score successes which would boost their morale. Those are the strengths.
Yeah, and presumably Grievous himself was quite an effective leader, wasn't he?
Very much so indeed. I mean, he'd been at this game for 3.5 years when I got there, and he was an extremely effective leader. As a weakness, they had weaknesses too, which we did in the end exploit. Morale naturally depended on success. And if success was denied to EOKA, then morale fell, as it always does in these things. And the cell structure of the whole organization made members susceptible to rumor and maybe to uncertainty. And there was also a considerable shortage of highly trained, effective leaders. And so the elimination of any one of them had a disproportionate effect on the efficiency of the organization as a whole.
Right, now having had a look at this organization and determined some of its strengths and weaknesses, what did you then conceive as your military aim?
Well, it was quite clear to me that there's only one worthwhile target in the whole of Cyprus, and that was Master George Grievous himself and his immediate entourage. And so that was, in a word, in the military field, my military aim was to eliminate him, literally.
To get in, to penetrate EOKA and eliminate Grievous.
Him, yeah.
He had a Greek code name, hadn't he?
Digenis.
Digenis,
Yeah.
Yes, after some Greek folk hero.
Yeah.
Now, in order to get at him, at Digenis or Grievous, what were your military resources? What had you got under your command to do this job?
Well, I had really considerable forces. I should explain that as Director of Operations, I was responsible to the Governor entirely for the employment and the use of all security forces, whether they be the civil administration, the civil police, or the 3 armed forces. I was his Director of Operations, and I was entirely responsible to him for everything that happened in the security field.
Was that something new with your arrival, or had your predecessor?
Oh, no, that
had always been so.
Oh, yes, that had been so.
That was a firm principle.
Oh, yes,
of
it
command.
was nothing to do. It was established when I arrived, and thank heavens it was, I may say so.
And so what were all these forces that you had?
Well, first of all, a word about the civil police. As I mentioned, a very large number of British police officers were seconded to it. The Chief Constable was a British officer. John Brown was the Chief Constable, seconded from the Nottinghamshire Police Force. In the early days of the emergency, the Greeks, the civil police, had considerable success in arresting some of the leading members of the EOKA organization. I'm talking about the early summer of 1955. And this made it quite plain to Grievous that the first thing he had to do if his organization was to grow, that he had to eliminate the civil police force. And so he had a dead set at the Greek Cypriot element, including assassinating many members. And this greatly affected their efficiency, naturally. The next problem was, and as a result of that, the bias in the civil police force shifted from being largely Greek Cypriot to Turkish Cypriot. The next thing was, just before I arrived in the early summer, as Hugh has already commented, there were considerable intercommunal riots, and the sort of efficiency of the Turkish Cypriot force became somewhat suspect. So we relied rarely on the small British element, which was reinforced from England. And this threw a tremendous burden on the shoulders of the military forces, because rarely there was no effective police force to do what are called police duties, patrolling, crowd control, and all that sort of thing. There was so much civil police. The Navy had made a very large contribution to setting up an organization to control entry of arms, people, and literature into Cyprus. They provided some 5 ships on constant patrol around the waters of Cyprus, backed up by coastal radar stations and by maritime air reconnaissance. Their headquarters, they had a headquarters alongside mine. On the air side, the Royal Air Force were very heavily engaged, really, in protecting their own bases at down at Akrotiri, which is a modern base, and the other one, which was Nicosia Airport, which was also an international airport. They, however, did produce one absolutely vital link in the chain, which was a ubiquitous squadron of RF helicopters, which I use heavily for getting me around. And finally, the army. There were considerable forces deployed in Cyprus, some 17 battalions or their equivalent. And as a result of the intercontinental troubles earlier on, in fact, the resident battalions had been reinforced by the Parachute Brigade and by the 1st Guards Brigade. And so there was no lack of soldiers on the ground. And a brigade or battalion was in support of each of the district security committees.
And you had an armoured car regiment as well?
And an armoured car regiment as well, yes, indeed.
And presumably that regiment was split in support of various...
Not really. The bulk of it was in Nicosia. I mean, part of it provided the escort for Hugh. The other, it did have a squadron down at Famagusta looking after this part of the world, but they were terribly useful.
Do you reckon, or did you reckon at the time when you arrived, that you had enough in the way of forces on the island to deal with the problem?
Well, the first thing I did on arrival was I was determined to spend about a week looking around to gauge the situation. And I wasn't going to come to any instant conclusions, naturally. I picked the brains of people who had been there for a long time and saw how things were working myself. And as a result of this sort of week I spent in gauging the situation, bearing in the background of my mind what my aim was, I came to 4 conclusions. And the first one, the organization for the control of operations from my headquarters and from my headquarters through the district security committees, which were organized in each of these civilian districts. There are 8 of them. And as it happens, of the commissioners or assistant commissioners in charge, one was a Turkish Cypriot, he was a Famagusta, and 2 were Greek Cypriots, and the remaining 5 were British. But the organization was fine, nothing wrong with that at all. And secondly, I thought that I had more than enough soldiers for the task in hand, and I think it's worthwhile me just reading out exactly what I wrote to the CIGS in a letter towards the end of October. And these are exactly what I said. I hope I shall not have to eat my words, but I personally should be glad to see a thinning out of the number of soldiers in the island to the extent of the Parachute Brigade and the 1st Guards Brigade. It is not that I don't like their company, I do, but I believe there are far too many soldiers milling about the island at the moment, creating unnecessary targets. If, however, intercontinental violence breaks out again, of course it would be an entirely different matter.
I must say, I think you must be the only general in history who ever had too many soldiers.
Yes, well, indeed.
But presumably, you mentioned earlier that you believed the key to this was intelligence.
Yes. That is so. And my next main conclusion was this, that quite frankly, my worst fears regarding the intelligence organization were confirmed when I looked at it. And again, I think it is worthwhile me quoting, so no one can accuse me of hindsight, exactly what I said to the CIGS in the same letter at the same time. My biggest headache at the moment is intelligence. Without wishing to cast aspersions on anyone, the intelligence organization falls far short of any other activity in the island, which is a ridiculous situation, as indeed it was. I put forward some pretty radical proposals to the governor, which I'm glad to say he has accepted in toto. I only hope that the Colonial Office will act with dispatch in implementing them. Until this is done, I'm very blind, and I simply must have one chap in the intelligence organization in whom I have every confidence and with whom alone I deal. This is not the situation at the moment, and it is quite hopeless. As I say to everyone out here, we shall win in the military field more by brains than by brawn, and it is in the intelligence field that we must apply our superior brains. And as a footnote there, let me, in case anyone should get the wrong impression, I do not want to imply in any way whatsoever that the intelligence organization lacked courageous or competent men. It certainly did not. But what it needed was a new sense of direction and cohesion and leadership from the top to make the best use of the opportunities available to it.
This, of course, is where you come into the picture eventually, Sir John, but you're not on the island yet. Do you agree with General Darling's views on the vital importance of intelligence in this kind of operation?
Yes, I certainly do. I agree totally with it. And one of the words which he used was, if you haven't got good intelligence, I certainly would have thought, and did in fact see in Kenya in the fight against Myanmar, that the director of operations must be blind, not totally blind, but certainly he can't see where he's going, and he's got to have good intelligence to assist him to get there.
Hugh Carradine, do you agree with the picture of Cyprus as painted by General Darling on his arrival?
Yes, I do. Well, we were preoccupied with the situation day by day in regard to violence and all kinds of terrorism. But we were mainly concerned with the result of the initiative that had been taken in the summer, called the Macmillan Plan. And it had been, as I said, very ill received, violently received by both sides. So it was of the utmost importance that there should be no wavering in our policy in dealing with the threat in the island itself. Had we shown weakness at that time or incapacity to deal with it, then the main hope of a political initiative would have been rapidly killed. So it was of the utmost consequence at that particular time that we should show that our new plan, unlike previous plans, was something we were going to go through with to the utmost of our capacity, violently as opposed as it might be. So it was at that time of the central and vital importance that two things should run at the same time. The plan, which was gaining a good deal of international support, and the effort in the island to make sure that they couldn't upset it by violence.
Right, now the effort in the island, General, how did you go about the military operations?
Well, my proposals for the reorganization of the intelligence setup were accepted by the governor on the 20th of October. I didn't reckon I would achieve much until my new chief of intelligence arrived. So I waited with great interest and keenness the arrival of John Prendergast. Meanwhile, we had to get on with the job as best we could with the resources at hand. And let me briefly describe how I tackled the job. My first task, as I saw it, was to seize the initiative in the military field in the same way as it had already been gained in the political field. And as a first step, I decided to embark on a hectic program of visits to all units to explain to them exactly how we can tackle the job and to pass on to them the gist of the Prime Minister's remarks. And in doing that, I was very conscious of the fact that here I was doing something which George Grievous couldn't possibly do. He had no possibility of going around and speaking to his soldiers in a way that I could, quite frankly. And in doing this, I gave one undertaking to every single member of the security forces. And what I said was this, that any member of the security forces who discharges his duty in the light of the knowledge of the situation at the time and with common sense would have my complete backing. And there's no need for him to look over his shoulder in doing his duty. Now this is very important, because by the nature of operations, command had to be decentralized down to a very low level, junior officers, junior NCOs. And it was absolutely essential in my mind they should realize that they would have my complete backing in doing their duty, and they had no reason to go about their task in some half-hearted way.
Now you said that command was devolved right down, sometimes to section commanders, presumably.
Oh, absolutely.
What were the general tactics that were adopted?
Well, the reason for this was that I felt very strongly, one of the things I said was that you could not tackle an underground movement by overground means, and it's a simple sort of phrase that people understood. And I was quite determined that we should go about our task with more subtlety, as indeed EOKA did, and take a leaf out of their book. And so what we did was we really abandoned the time-honoured business of having large cordon and search operations and so on, which you may well remember. And instead of that, we had small patrols, foot patrols, 2 to 5 men probably, sometimes without an NCO in charge. And they would lie up in a given area for several days, living very rough, very hardly. And they would gradually watch what went on, gain the pattern of gang movement by observation, and gradually get a grip on the situation. And this caused a tremendous question mark in the minds of the terrorists, as you can imagine, because they couldn't really know what was going on. Yeah. It was a very heartening experience going around speaking to my command. I spoke to people quite informally, in large numbers, small numbers, any old how, using my RF helicopter for the purpose. Without it, I could never have got around in the time available to me. And I think the impression I gained at the time is best summed up by what I sent to the CIGS in a letter early in November. And this is what I said. You will not be surprised to learn that the soldiers are in terrific form. By now I must have seen, quite informally, spoken to about 20,000 men. And I have not had a single grumble or met a discontented soldier yet. It is the usual story of the more the British soldier has to do, the better he is, which I think is a very true saying and well known to all of us. Now, in these talks, I mentioned briefly what the principles which will govern our actions. And the first was the phrase, we would beat EOKA more by brains than by brawn. And the point here is that a subversive terrorist movement is not beaten by taking it out, should we say, of the ordinary people. Success is achieved by a sustained drive by small bodies of highly trained troops directed at, say, the leadership. And for that, you've got to have really high-grade intelligence. This was one field in which I was determined, the intelligence field in which we would use our brains to the greatest possible extent. Another field was the scientific field. There are many ways scientific know-how could help us. Measures to tackle the pressure mine, measures to defeat the hides of EOKA had underneath the floors of houses, vacuum, detect a vacuum, measures for surveillance, for night vision and so on. There are many means fields in which we use our brains to help us defeat EOKA.
What about the sort of higher direction of all this?
The higher direction, the executive action was taken through my headquarters, known as COSDO. That was a short title for the headquarters of the Chief of Staff, the Director of Operations. My Chief of Staff was a very capable and super man called Brigadier Paul Liddell. And he, through this organization, gave effect to all my orders, really. And the important point, I think, here is to make that within that organization, there was a small element from the government under a defense secretary, and it is his job to see that security forces obtain from government all the help they need in doing their job.
What about the police? Were they knitted into that as well?
Very much so. In the security field, it had nothing to do with all normal police work, but they were under my orders entirely for action in the security field in maintaining law and order.
And your headquarters was a joint one in that sense?
My headquarters, therefore, was a joint one, and it was alongside the government secretariat, and my ministry headquarters was separate, slightly a distance away in Wolseley Barracks. I was also determined that EOKA would fight on my terms, if they wanted to fight me, as apparently they did, so that my soldiers would get the best of any engagement and they would get the worst. I thought this was the simplest way of stopping them being nasty to us. And this is largely a matter of getting my soldiers out of their vehicles, onto their feet, avoiding night movement on roads, and on varying our methods, never doing the same thing twice running the same way. So you have to never foretell what our reaction would be. And finally, there was a question of public relations in Cyprus. There was a thriving local press, as the governor will remember, and this had been used by grievers to whip up passions and support for EOKA. On top of it, there was a very strong body of local correspondents of the press and the radio from all over the world, you might say, mainly England, but all over the world. And I decided that the best thing I could do was to try and get these people to come along with me and to help me in really winning the battle for public opinion. So I made myself available to them to help them do their job in the hope that they would come to me for information rather than making it up themselves.
Did you have a senior public relations
indeed,
officer?
a civilian, yes.
But you yourself were available to brief the press
I made myself
from time
as
to time.
available as I could to brief individual correspondents who wanted to see me, or if they, time to time, I held press conferences.
Now, I remember when, because I was on the island at the time with my regiment, commanding an infantry company, and I remember an incident when the Daily Mirror attacked you very, very viciously indeed. What was the story behind that?
Yes, I think I must, just before I answer that question, just say the circumstances in which it happened. I decided to mount a number of operations all over the Cyprus to gain information and to gain the initiative. And two particular ones were in the Kyrenia and Paphos areas. And these were on what I regarded my way of doing things, the introduction of small patrols into these two large areas up in the north and in the southwest of the island, and gradually getting a grip over the situation. And clearly, these operations wouldn't come to fruition tomorrow or the next day. They would take time. And at this time, we were under great criticism in the press for doing all sorts of things, or probably doing nothing. Most of the weight of this criticism was directed at me rather than at Hugh. But it was alleged that I was one of those people who talked an awful lot and did absolutely nothing. There was no confidence in the high command. The governor was being pushed out by the generals. The general should be governor, and so on and so forth. And so I decided the best way of stifling this was to invite some of the more senior and responsible press correspondents to my house one evening, quite quietly, and tell them exactly what we were going to do in the Kyrenia and Paphos areas. And this I did. And one of the people who in that little sort of party was a man called Dennis Martin, the foreign correspondent of the Daily Mirror. And they're very grateful for what I said, because I told them the score. And about halfway through the course of the operation, suddenly I was discovered, and there was a terrific, venomous attack on me by the Daily Mirror. And all sorts of people rang me up from England and said what comment I had. Well, I said I can't make any comment until the English papers arrived. It didn't do until the next evening. And the upshot was there was an article with some very unpleasant photographs, I think, of me, saying that I was did not have a grip of the situation and we were doing nothing and the terrorists were winning and so on. And the extraordinary thing was this article apparently was written by Dennis Martin, which I couldn't understand because he knew the truth. Well, he came to me very shamefaced and apologized profusely and said that in fact he hadn't written the article. And what in fact had happened, he had written an article and his editor, for reasons of his own, had changed the drift of the article but published it as if Dennis Martin had written it. Well, he was most apologetic, and he said he wanted to go home and see his editor and square things up, which he did. And no sooner had he gone home than the Kyrenia and Paphos operations came to a head. And in Kyrenia, you were there, you may remember,
yes.
We nailed Matt Seitz, the area leader, and killed him. We captured several of his gang, and a lot of his winter hide and weapons. And the Paphos operation was only less successful in that we didn't secure the area leader, but we secured, I think, 12 of his gang and all the winter hide. So this is headline news, you may remember. Drove a coach and four through the Daily Mirror line, made them appear ridiculous, which they didn't like at all. And so when Dennis Martin came back, he was very piano, and said his editor now wanted to show their great appreciation of the marvellous work of the security forces and what we were doing. And to do that, he would like to run a number of Christmas parties and Christmas presents for my soldiers, and particularly those in the detached areas. And I accepted this with alacrity. And I said, of course, you'll get the bill for this, because I had to distribute them, all these presents. The Daily Mirror had no resource of doing it. And I did this. And at the end, I had the great pleasure of sending to the editor of the Daily Mirror a bill for a little over £3,000, which I reckon was my damages for libel, you might say.
Sweet revenge.
Sweet revenge. And my soldiers had a very happy and agreeable Christmas as a result of this episode.
Right, well, this is Christmas, 1958. The Director of Operations is ready for the major EOKA offensive. He for his Chief of Intelligence to arrive. And in the next part of this film, we will discuss exactly how the final round was fought.